All right, we're on part 2 of The Commander and the King, an Easter story. And this part is called A Mystery in the Night. First, among my morning duties, I sent messengers to the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin, and told them that I would have the prisoner brought before them that afternoon so that they could formalize their accusations. In the meantime, I would learn as much about my prisoner as was available. I'd tasked my personal scribe with an overnight research project to see what he could discover. Until that briefing, I had plenty of work to do. Military duties didn't stop because of a single odd inmate. After a hurried morning of command meetings, supply logistics, and reviewing troop drills, I returned to my tower chamber to meet with my scribe. While the regular morning's work had kept me occupied, the unanswered questions about my charge had persisted in my mind. The scribe was admitted by the bodyguards at my door. I'd hand-selected this scribe years ago, in spite of his lack of formal training. He was technically a soldier. He'd been the best record keeper I'd ever had in the field. So much so that I had relieved him from the more violent elements of active duty and put him to work with documentation, where he had thrived ever since. By now, he barely resembled the scared kid I'd first noted at a battle briefing in a muddy command tent during a miserable campaign. He was younger than he looked. I knew very little of his background or how he came by his impression of education. This morning, as always, we kept pleasantries to a minimum, as my scribe peculiarly seemed comfortable only when discussing his work. In his slightly distracted but crisp manner, he began to recite what he had learned about the prisoner. Saul of Tarsus, Cilicia, he goes by Paul. The scribe spoke as he always did when he briefed me on facts, looking towards the ceiling like he was reading invisible words. And all the time I knew him, I'd never seen him need or reference notes unless it was a map. The scribe went on. Saul, or Paul, as he's called now, he's a man of some prominence, to be sure. Highly educated, impressive credentials. He's actually quite well known here in Jerusalem, and, I gather, many other cities, even in Asia. He's a Jew of their tribe of Benjamin. As a younger man, he was educated in this city and studied as a protege of Gamaliel himself. Here, for the first time, my scribe looked directly at me, as though this last point should mean something to me. Gamaliel, I faltered. Have I heard that name before? My scribe picked up pace in rapid explanation. Okay, so you know how these Jews go way, way back to Abraham, and even to the beginning of all history. Right, so they say, I equivocated. The scribe blinked. They say it because they can document it in amazing detail. Anyway, the leading religious Jews call themselves Pharisees. Yes, I interrupted, relieved to recognize part of the plot. Yes, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the two major religious sects of the Jews, make up much of their Sanhedrin. I'm presenting to them this afternoon in order to determine their charges against the prisoner. What does that ancient history have to do with the prisoner? My scribe slowed and returned to his train of thought. The prisoner, Paul. As I was saying, the Pharisees and Sadducees follow a strict Jewish tradition, mostly oral tradition. It's an extremely detailed and complex set of laws derived from the ancient law of Moses. You do know about Moses, right? Yes, of course, I said. I mean, I've heard of him. He originally led these people out of Egypt, right? Right. That was something like 1,500 years ago. So Moses was the guy who wrote the Torah, which is that detailed history of ancient civilization I mentioned. Also, Moses penned the original comprehensive system of laws, quite brilliantly, if I do say so. Much later, after the Jews were exiled to Babylon, they believed that the exile happened because they didn't follow Moses' laws closely enough. So a very famous contemporary teacher named Rabbi Hillel established an additional system of laws to enforce and uphold the original Mosaic law. These new, more complicated laws are sometimes referred to as the Talmud and the Mishnah. The Pharisees and Sadducees are the ones who strictly follow this more recent legal system of behavior. I was starting to get lost. trying to place all the players and what I'd already known about the Jewish timeline. Okay, so Moses was 1,500 years ago. Then the old kings I've heard about, like King David. Then the Jews were taken prisoners in Babylon, what, 500 years ago? More like 600, actually. Okay, 600. Then they come back here. When was that? Well, that's your 500 years ago, give or take. Okay, then this Rabbi Hillel guy designs all the extra laws for the Pharisees. Well, when was he? About 75 years ago. He lived through our Roman conquest of these people. All right, so we're getting closer to the present. Who's next? Gamaliel, the prisoner Paul's academic mentor? Who exactly is Gamaliel in all this? He is none other than the direct grandson of Rabbi Hillel. Gamaliel is literally the greatest modern teacher of the Talmud and the Mishnah, not to mention the Law of Moses and the Torah. At least he was. He died about 5 years ago. I knew I'd heard that name before. So our prisoner, Saul, or Paul, or whatever his name is, was a disciple of Gamaliel. Why this troublesome guy, Paul? Shouldn't Gamaliel's understudy be a ranking Pharisee? That's the thing. Paul was a Pharisee. He was one of the best there ever was in terms of the law, not just knowing it, but also understanding and righteously following it to the letter. Nicodemus himself once called Paul one of the greatest emerging scholars of the day. What I mean is, the guy you have locked up over there was not so long ago on track to be a major player in the Sanhedrin. I was properly confused. Wait, who's Nicodemus? Never mind. Now hold on. When I pulled the prisoner Paul out of the mob yesterday, the Sanhedrin hotshots were literally trying to murder him. They were beating him as I showed up. He'd be dead if I'd arrived on the scene much later. That doesn't make any sense if he's their best and brightest. My scribe was more animated than I'd ever seen him. Exactly. Why do they hate him? What did he do? Right, I agreed. Yes, he replied enthusiastically. An awkward silence fell. My scribe and I blinked at each other. This is where you tell me why they hate him, I prompted. My scribe sighed heavily and slumped in his chair. I'm sorry, Commander, I can't figure it out. I was hoping you knew more than I did about that, having directly talked with him yesterday and all. I stood up in exasperation. You mean we had a city in chaos, a bloodthirsty mob yesterday? I nearly flogged a Roman citizen without a trial. You flogged him? My scribe was gobsmacked. Nearly, I responded coldly. Nearly. He didn't mention his Roman citizenship until he was on the rack. From the looks of it, he's had plenty of floggings, by the way. I thought he was the Egyptian terrorist from a few years back. But that's, my scribe started to protest. Back to the matter at hand, I interrupted meaningfully, pacing in frustration. We had a violent mob, a city in uproar. We barely avoided an impromptu execution. We have a prisoner. I'm presenting him to the Sanhedrin in an hour, and I have no idea why they want him executed. In all your research, you couldn't figure out a thing about that? I tried, he threw up his hands. I asked several local sources, even perused some Hebrew records. All I could learn was that it has something to do with the Jewish legend of a Messiah who's some kind of mythic national hero and a disagreement between Paul and the Sanhedrin. A disagreement about a legend? I was incredulous, practically shouting. Those Sanhedrin guys disagree all the time. I can hear them arguing from here sometimes, but they don't usually attempt to stone each other in the temple courtyards like a bloody out-of-control mob with half the city involved. My scribe waited wisely for me to calm down. I took a deep breath and sat. Composing myself, I asked, what's so special about this disagreement? My scribe smiled slyly. Maybe they'll tell you at your meeting this afternoon. Right. Maybe they'll tell me. In the meantime, thanks for the history lesson. At least I know the guy's name. Anytime, Commander. Dismissed, I sighed. As he turned to leave, my scribe stopped at the door. Commander, if they do explain it at the Sanhedrin, Will you let me know what it is they hate about Paul? My turn to smile slyly. With a phalanx of guards, I personally escorted Paul back down the colonnade towards the temple. The Sanhedrin met almost daily in the Hall of Hewn Stones on the north side of the Jewish temple complex. Paul didn't say much along the way. I supposed his pensiveness was appropriate, seeing as how he was going on trial for a death penalty and all. I wondered if he would be more forthcoming today, since he knew I had the authority to act on the verdict of the day's legal proceedings. I'd unbound him, and I think we both knew the guards were symbolically to protect the public from him, but more practically to protect him from the public. I wanted to get a little more from him as he walked stolidly between his guards under the hot sun. Anything you should tell me before I present you to the council? I used a formal but friendly tone. Paul looked up suddenly, like I'd interrupted him. He gazed thoughtfully toward the gate leading from the temple complex out to the valley. He nodded towards that gate. I saw a saint, an innocent man, stoned to death just over there. He stated it like he was pointing out a wine vendor he'd once visited. A saint? I asked, surprised at the term, and at the unexpected statement. Innocent, but stoned to death. In an attempt to draw Paul out, I tried to empathize. That must have been hard to witness. Matter-of-factly, Paul replied, Actually, I helped them do it. No pride, no bitterness. It was like he was making an observation, connecting something I didn't understand. I regarded him ruminating on the memory. Glancing toward the sky, he mused, I didn't know it at the time, but it was a beautiful day, like today. And here I thought he was worried about his trial. Once again, my understanding had been sabotaged in an effort to comprehend this man. We made no more conversation as we arrived and crowded our way into the Sanhedrin meeting. The Hall of Hewn Stone was packed. I'd been in here a few times before, and it was an uncomfortable place for me. Lots of overeducated, underfamiliar beards blustering about things I didn't understand, and none of them had much reason to want me here. Today, I could quickly pick out the Jews' high priest Ananias and his entourage, in addition to the 70-plus Sanhedrin members, not to mention many attendants, scribes, and others present whom I would have called courtiers, but the term didn't quite suit. I brought Paul down to the center of the room, a fixation. The throng quieted as I called out, I present to you the man arrested outside the temple yesterday, Saul of Tarsus, called Paul. A pretentious murmur ran around the room. Paul caught my eye as though he was surprised I knew his name. I pressed on. Legally, no Roman citizen can be corporally punished or executed without a trial. I invite you to bring your accusations against him in an orderly fashion. The prisoner may speak for himself. Withdrawing a few paces, I listened and observed. An interpreter stood next to me to make sure I could keep up with whatever languages were used, especially Hebrew. Paul examined the masked room through squinted eyes. I wondered if the bright sun outside had dazzled him. He straightened and spoke. Brothers, I have lived my life in good conscience before God to this very day. After my multiple visits here, I was only beginning to understand the nuances of the Jewish council. I still couldn't quite follow how much of the conversation occurred between the lines. I saw Ananias gesture and mutter to a Pharisee standing near Paul. Unexpectedly, the man slapped Paul on the mouth, hard. Shaking his head, Paul took a deep breath and shot back towards Ananias. God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, but you order me to be struck against the law. 2 sentences in, and one mouth already slapped. This presentation was definitely not going how I'd anticipated or hoped. The Pharisee who had struck Paul sneered in retort, "And would you revile God's high priest?" Paul's posture changed instantly. "I didn't know, brothers, that he was the high priest. After all, it is written, 'You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people.'" I wondered. Paul identified as part of this people, but how could he not know it was the high priest if even I, an outsider, knew who Ananias was? It occurred to me, perhaps Paul was half blind. A ranking Sadducee, in an effort to prevent Paul's making any further personal defense, initiated an announcement that the Pharisees would speak their accusations first, followed by the Sadducees. As Paul absorbed the announcement, he quickly shouted down the man by making his own much louder proclamation. "Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you today." This bizarre statement only increased my confusion. I could see Paul was trying to get the Pharisees' contingent on his side by calling himself one of them. But up until this point, precisely nobody had said anything about dead people rising. However, Paul's cryptic line seemed to carry great import with the council. Voices intensified. Some of the leading Pharisees stood up and shouted that Paul was innocent. I was sure I'd seen them participating in Paul's beating yesterday, so the sudden reversal was beyond me. The whole Sanhedrin began shouting back and forth, some claiming Paul was virtuous, some insisting he was a madman, some labeling him a traitor or heretic, while many claimed simultaneously Paul had seen angels or talked with spirits. Several of the Sadducees near Paul lunged towards him, demanding for an immediate sentence of death by stoning. Similarly, Paul's newfound defenders also grabbed hold of him, crying that he should have a new trial on different charges, while a few even shouted that he be released immediately. Two violent mobs in as many days. What had I done to deserve this? I'd learned yesterday that the only way to calm them was to get Paul out of there post-haste, else blood would surely spill. I barked the order to my men, who were standing near Paul, presumably guarding this prisoner. They threw themselves between Paul and the grasping council, while the rest of my soldiers who had escorted him here forced the frothing members back. We barreled Paul out of the hall of hewn stones as the entire council spewed violently behind us, inciting threats, making accusations, and repeating calls for execution or more hearings. As we ushered Paul back to the barracks, I brooded on the situation. I'd learned that Paul's predicament had something to do with dead men rising, and he had a reputation for speaking with spirits or angels. All his people seemed to agree he was some kind of supernatural mystic in addition to his academic credentials. However, I still had no clarity whatsoever on any legal charge against him or why the Jews harbored so much vitriol towards him. Most of me was annoyed with the chaotic circus in which I'd unexpectedly found myself participating for the last 2 days. Another part of me was itching to simply know the answers to the questions I harbored about this strange prisoner. Solving either would require an entirely new tack. My displays of authority had so far backfired. Legal proceedings had proven useless, if not deleterious. I needed Paul to open up to me. Until that happened, I could see Paul looked worse for the wear. His battering at the council was material, especially as he'd hardly recovered from yesterday's beating outside the temple. Paul didn't complain, but his steps were noticeably slower and less even than they had been this morning. The light seemed to bother his eyes. As we entered the fortress, I instructed my men to place Paul in solitary confinement, but provide good food, water, and whatever care was needed for him as well as his other 2 companions. Once he'd been isolated and refreshed, I would personally risk visiting Paul alone. I would hear whatever he would tell me. The sun was setting by the time I'd triaged my other duties to an extent I could visit Paul off the record. It wasn't strictly proper for me to speak in private with a prisoner. I wanted as few people as possible to know. Uncharacteristically, I instructed my bodyguards to stay at my chamber door and tell any visitors that I was inside and not to be disturbed. I left my cape and high-crested helmet on my table, opting for a less obvious accoutrement. Then, carrying a scroll under my arm in order to look busy, I moved purposefully with an air of distraction towards the supply depot situated near the prison quarters' holding cells. With the day's work winding down, nobody paid much attention to another soldier hurrying along. At the last moment, I diverted course and skirted past two protesting guards into the warden's little office, which was really just a personalized corner of the flogging chamber. Fortunately, the warden was alone in the room, if not a bit startled by my visits being both unannounced and unaccompanied. He was experienced enough to know that I owed him no explanation, so I didn't offer one. I simply told him I would speak alone with a prisoner, that he would admit nobody so long as I was there, and that nobody would know or mention I had been here. He accepted the instructions without argument. Come to think of it, I'm not sure if I'd ever heard the warden string two words together. Good man, the warden, his talent for interrogation notwithstanding. The prison quarters here in the fortress were not so large as the main prison in the city, but we had several holding cells, which mostly functioned like a jail. Unlike many prisons, this one didn't merit squads of full-time guards around the clock. We were plainly inside of a fortress. Any prisoner managing to slip through a locked cell door, then a barred internal gate, plus the warden and the two guards outside, would not only find himself trapped in a secure courtyard, but also would inevitably raise enough alarm to bring down the vigilant wrath of an entire barracks. While joyless and stuffy, the warden kept the small prison facility clean and in good order. He escorted me through the main internal gate, securing it behind us. I carried a fresh torch as it was quite dark in the intestines of this building. There were only a few narrow windows at the top of some cells, as much for air circulation as light. We made our way down the central passage. Empty cells stood on either side of us, staring like sentries. The only occupied cell had the other two prisoners, Paul's companions, resting quietly inside. I turned my face away as we passed, hoping they wouldn't recognize me from the previous day. At the end of the hallway, the warden gestured towards a solid door of solitary confinement. It had a small latched opening at the bottom for passing food, water, and waste buckets. I wasn't about to have my conversation with Paul through a diminutive trapdoor near my feet. I told the warden to open the solitary cell door and wait for me outside the gate at the top of the corridor until I called. The warden raised his eyebrows, but seeing as I was serious, he unbolted the cell door and headed back towards his chamber at the front of the building. The corridor and cell were dim. I was grateful for the torch, which I placed in a bracket on the wall behind me before drawing open the heavy entry to Paul's cell. I stood in the doorway, lit from behind by the torch. I didn't expect Paul to make a break for it, and if he did, he'd have to go through me, only to be in a safe-guarded corridor. I was not only much larger than he, but also a battle-hardened soldier. I was cautious, yet not worried. Paul's cell was appropriately sparse. A heavy bench bolted to the wall, and a waste bucket were the main furnishings. I was pleased to see that my instructions for comfort had been followed. A blanket was evident on the bench, and the remains of a simple meal testified, along with a water pitcher in a basin. Paul had been seated on the floor against the back of the cell and was rising to his feet as I filled the doorway. We looked at each other. I wanted him to speak first. Tribune Commander? He didn't sound certain. Lucky guess, I replied with an easy tone. Then, taking a chance, you don't see so well, do you? Could anybody see well in this near dark? I didn't want to play cryptic question games, so I remained still. Paul understood the meaning of my silence. No, he confirmed simply. I don't see so well, no matter the light. Enough to get around, but details can be difficult. Since birth or with age? I wanted him talking about himself. This topic seemed personal enough, and we had a little momentum. Neither, he surprised me with his reply. I waited for more. Call it a gift. He hinted at a story behind his condition. But you're not here to check up on my eyesight, are you, Commander? What you lack in eyesight, you seem to make up in quick thought and words. I hoped the compliment would set him at ease. It wasn't empty flattery, it was true. Some would say too quick with the words. He brushed off the compliment with a slight chuckle. I couldn't help a smirk of my own. Paul changed topics, and I could hear genuine concern in his voice. Commander, what of my companions, Trophimus and Luke? They're comfortable, I reassured him. There are no charges being made against them. I expect to release them early in the morning. I heard him sigh with relief. And me? He asked the obvious question. I snorted. Would you have me release you into the gentle care of the Sanhedrin? Or perhaps send you back through the temple courtyard? Paul considered and came to the same conclusion I had. He was safer here as the warden's guest and my charge than anywhere in the city. Maybe my companion should stay here too, he acknowledged. I'll release them discreetly, I reassured him. But I'm afraid your situation is more complicated. The Sanhedrin is, you could say, enthusiastically bringing formal charges against you. Paul nodded. Yet here you are, breaking protocol to speak with me privately. He was not afraid to highlight the truth of the situation and the questionable legality of my presence. Yes, here I am. My turn to acknowledge a point won fairly. He waited in silence. He'd cooperated so far. The next step would require my being forthright. Listen, Paul, I can't tell if you're crazy or if you just have a gift for making people around you act crazy. Nothing in the last 2 days adds up. Paul didn't seem bothered by my questioning his sanity. He spoke quietly. It's not me who makes them act like that. I was confused. What do you mean it's not you? They've tried to kill you twice now. I've never seen such seething rage, and for the life of me, I can't figure out specifically why they hate you. I was giving away more of my ignorance than I'd intended. My frustration was slipping through. Commander, Paul murmured, and the word shocked me because it was overflowing with compassion. Nobody'd spoken to me with that tone since a time I didn't allow myself to remember. Commander, he said gently, they don't hate me. I'm no enemy of theirs. If anything, I'm one of them. I leaned on the doorway, trying to reconcile the unexpected emotional surge I'd felt with the baffling statement he'd just made. How can you say that? What do you mean? I was struggling to articulate the myriad questions and protests he'd just opened up. Continuing in kindness, Paul went on. Not what, Commander, but who? It's not me they hate. It's not a crime I've committed. It's who I serve, who I represent. That's who they hate. Dumbly, I asked the obvious question. Who, then, do you serve? Matter-of-factly, Paul replied, I serve Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God, the salvation of my people. He's the reason I'm here. Their rejection of him is their rejection of me. Whatever I'd expected him to say, that wasn't it. If he'd said he served Cerberus, the three-headed dog of the underworld, I would have at least known he was off his rocker. But he wasn't raving. If anything, it made at least a little sense that his dispute with the Sanhedrin had something to do with a legendary Jewish hero, as my scribe had suggested. But that name, Jesus Christ, I'd heard it before somewhere, but what I'd heard didn't conform at all to what Paul was saying now. Paul was quiet while I took a moment to process. Help me out here. I used that line often to build confidence in my soldiers without giving over authority. You say you serve Jesus Christ, and the council hates you because they hate him. Yes, Paul nodded. But you also say that you are one of them or were one of them. Yes. And that makes them hate me all the more because I not only represent Jesus, but I represent what Jesus would make them if they would have him. And what would Jesus make them? I asked. Like me, a servant. They would be servants to a kingdom greater than they now know, servants in authority far above their current authority, but in humility and meekness, not asserting authority, not self-aggrandizing, but to bringing truth and good news in love. Authority, truth, humility, good news. Why wouldn't they want that? I was trying to understand. Paul smiled, wincing a bit through his swollen lip. Look at me, he gestured, as though he were the living answer to my question. Remember, I was one of them, one of the best of them, actually. The kingdom of Jesus Christ comes at a cost. You can't serve your own authority and his at the same time. Jesus knows the council loves their authority more than his. I stepped in before he went on. You keep saying that name, Jesus. You say you're his servant. You say he has an active kingdom. You say all the council knows him and hates him. I command the Roman garrison here. I'm pretty well versed in local kingdoms, and I've never heard of Jesus as some kind of reigning king. I mean, I've heard of him, but he was a folk hero, some kind of rebel decades ago, right? I mean, I know has a local following, people who still try and put his teaching about good living into practice, but Jesus was killed a long time ago, and his followers maintain he was some kind of martyr. Is that the same guy? Paul nodded. Same guy, but I don't think you've heard the truth about him. I sighed. Perhaps I don't know the details. But if you expect me to believe there's a powerful king around here that I've never heard of, then I'm going to need some more opinions. Feeling annoyed at the assertion, I hissed, I know authority. You say you serve this local nobody, this Jesus. I serve the emperor himself, Tiberius, Claudius, Caesar, Augustus, Germanicus. I have his name, I am his hand of authority in Jerusalem, and I know you've heard of him, and the council knows him too, because the whole world knows him. Paul laughed heartily. I do know him, Commander, and it seems we are both servants. As for the council, they don't much like your guy either, but at least he lets them keep what they think they have. I offered a wry smile of my own. So we have so much in common, you and I. Well, we've both heard of at least one of the kings in question, and we've both had a long day. He sat down gingerly on his bench and picked up his blanket. Go enjoy the comforts of your evening, Commander, before anybody realizes you were here. Recognizing I'd been dismissed by a prisoner in my own prison, but knowing I'd gain nothing by pointing it out, I softly pushed the cell door closed and headed back up the corridor with my ebbing torch in hand. As the warden opened the interior gate and headed down to secure Paul's cell, I thought about the name Jesus Christ. I knew where I could learn more about him. It was the last place I'd been expecting to go tonight, and I felt profoundly uneasy about the reunion it would require. Decades ago, when I was just a brand new soldier being groomed as an officer, my benefactor had sent me far from my home in Rome to be specially trained by troops stationed in the outpost of Caesarea. Caesarea, a few days' travel from Jerusalem, was situated conveniently on the coast. It was not only the seat of the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, but also had a heavy troop presence. I was a young man, saddled with high expectations for a military career. Caesarea was a reasonable location for my being taught basic politics, Roman warfare, as well as personal battle skills. For the latter, my combat training, I'd been handed over to a training officer. My training officer was a legionary named Jago, but who went by many nicknames. Jago reigned in terror over my daily routines for much of the 18 months I'd spent in Caesarea. My youth had been full of athletics, including wrestling and boxing, so I'd arrived confident and cocky, but nothing could have prepared me for the pitiless grinding I would undergo at the hands of Jago. He had broken me down so mercilessly. There had been times where I'd been afraid his demands would kill me, followed by mourning that I might live to see another day of it. I'd arrived in Caesarea with a couple dozen other youths of high birth like myself. Only a handful of us persisted to the end of our scheduled time there. long enough to have Jago actually salute us and declare us ready to serve Rome on the battlefield and likely to die quickly, but without totally embarrassing me or the emperor. Besides long, thirsty, hot survival marches, being taken far offshore and dumped into deep water, forced to find our own way back to land, deprived of sleep into near madness, endless memorization of facts, checklists, and pointless poems, besides wilderness survival and sometimes having to eat things rejected by wild dogs, besides long periods of isolation, endless moving of earth and stones for greater physical strength, Jago had boxed, wrestled, and fought us in every way imaginable. I skirmished with the other trainees too, but Jago had taken a special interest in making me suffer personally. My noble tutors in Caesarea had often wondered at my exhaustion and battered appearance, but I was forbidden to speak details of my combat training. From fists to sticks to spears to lances to planks to shields, bows to daggers, and ultimately swords, in the dirt, on foot, or on horseback, Jago left me bruised, bloody, and originally crying for mercy. Those cries had evolved into a cold, focused rage I didn't know I'd had in me. By the time I'd been deployed as a young officer into the campaigns in Britain, I was hardened, skillful, and violent. I quickly developed a reputation of brutal efficiency on the battlefield. Jago's training not only saved my life many times over, but also made me stand out enough to be promoted and eventually develop the more nuanced elements necessary to being a senior officer. As much as I shuddered at the memory of Jago, he'd made me an effective combat soldier. My initial loathing and fear of him had turned to respect and later an appreciation for the foundation he'd provided for my military career. While my career had subsequently flourished, Jago's had taken a bizarre turn. Immediately after I had returned to Rome from Caesarea, Jago had been transferred to Jerusalem, presumably to whip many more troops into shape, poor souls. However, I'd later heard hushed rumors that Jago had some kind of trouble in Jerusalem, whispers of some dereliction of duty. That didn't sound like him at all. The man was the most professional and dedicated soldier I'd ever met. I heard that instead of public punishment for his shortcomings, he'd been hastily shipped far from Jerusalem and ultimately sent to fight in Britain in relative obscurity. We'd been in Britain at the same time, but it was a massive campaign and I'd never seen Jago while I was there. For a long time, I'd assumed he perished in the campaigns. Based on my conversation with Paul in the prison, there was a reason I was suddenly remembering Jago. In what had today become the most uncanny fact, as I recalled it, the conflicting rumors I'd heard about Jago's downfall all had one thing in common: the name Jesus. When Paul had mentioned Jesus Christ during our conversation in his cell, I'd stirred once hearing that my old training officer, Graham Jago, had once personally encountered this man Jesus. While I didn't know any details, I knew the event had something to do with the sudden twist in Jago's life. Until mentioning the man that evening, most of what I'd known or heard of Jesus had been confused reports in connection with Jago's mysterious reassignment, something about Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the prophet, magician, teacher, Messiah, criminal, Jesus the dead man, presumably executed for his crimes. Jesus, who still apparently had a few followers professing his teaching or philosophy or whatever it was. Jesus, the one who had somehow shaken the unshakable Jago. Upon being placed as tribune commander in Jerusalem a few years back, I made a habit of knowing all I could about what was happening inside the city walls. Eventually, a standard report on Jerusalem's notable inhabitants had mentioned Jago himself. He had not succumbed in Britain, as I'd assumed. As soon as he could justify it, Jago had left Britain and resigned from the military, and of all places, he'd returned directly to Jerusalem. He'd presumably lived here quietly ever since, else we would have crossed paths already. If my intel was correct, Jago was still inexplicably here in my city. Of course, he would know I was tribune commander of the Roman garrison here, but we hadn't sought each other out. Why would we? I had no fond memories of him. My childhood had ended upon being handed over to Jago. What could we possibly have to say to each other? But now, because of Paul and the uprisings in the city, it was my duty to discover the truth about Jesus Christ. Mere rumors and arguments wouldn't do. Paul was apparently not a reliable source with claims that Jesus was some sort of ruling king. I would go see Jago. I needed him to tell me about Jesus Christ and what had happened between him and Jesus more than 20 years ago in this very city.